Hello. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, everyone, to Psychiatry Grand Rounds. Our speaker today is Dr. R.Brown, who is the Associate Chairman of the Department of Psychiatry. He's also over psychiatry at the Mountain Home VA Psychosocial Rehabilitation and Recovery Program. Dr. Brown completed his undergraduate and medical school training at the University of Rochester in New York. His internship was completed at the U.S. Air Force Medical Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and his psychiatry residency training at Wright State University in the combined U.S. Air Force Integrated Residency Program. He is a distinguished fellow of the APA. He sits on the VHA Transgender Training Work Group. Dr. Brown has more than 100 publications, with a large portion of that being on gender identity issues and the neuropsychiatric implications of HIV infection. He has given expert testimony in many high-profile court cases. He's been on numerous national and local televised media events and gives talks all over the country. He's actually come here this morning from one that he gave last night in Knoxville. Today, he's here with a presentation titled Killing the Bore, How to Give Effective Medical Presentations. On a personal note, I know Dr. R.Brown to be an avid outdoorsman, and so welcome, Dr. Brown.
How about now? Good. Well, welcome to my grand rounds this morning. Today I will be presenting on how to give an effective medical presentation that won't put your audience to sleep. As part of my residency training program, I too was forced to do a grand rounds, actually 3 of them. And I was petrified and anxious. I had to use these 3x5 cards with every word written down to manage my anxiety. I struggled through those first few, but they're not very good presentations. Exposure therapy works. I hope to teach and model what I have learned. Sorry. In over 700 presentations. I hope to model as part of this program some things not to do and maybe some things to do. And we'll of course assume that the residents who didn't come today know all of this material, and that when they present their grand rounds, they won't make any of the mistakes that I'm going to model today or discuss on the slides. So we will feel very free to criticize them with respect to their presentation styles if they're not here today. Right, Dr. White? Yes. So I will be making some errors throughout the talk, and I'll be hopefully modeling some positive behaviors that are useful. Because who wants to listen to another boring talk? Oh, sorry, hang on. Hello? Oh, it's Dr. White. Sorry, I forgot to turn my cell phone off. That never happens with speakers, does it? It never happens in the audience either. Somebody does that in the audience, I always ask, hey, is that for me? This is how I feel about medical student evaluation forms. Okay, so this is a view off my front porch. Something to catch your eye, something to get you a little more interested than just a standard slide. And this usually catches people's attention as well. I don't want to hear another boring talk, right? You can take boring material and make it interesting. And Jim Cramer, if you've not watched that show on CNBC with Jim Cramer, takes the most boring information possible on investing and brings it to life. He brings passion to it and makes it interesting. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And he is a master. So if you want to see a great speaker with passion and energy, watch that show. I can tell you, by the way, on this slide, this is a boar that I killed with that knife, the first boar that I actually killed with a knife. And Dr. White and I were talking about hunting in Texas. And I've had people come up to me when I've used this slide in other presentations 5, 10 years later and say, I remember that slide you put up about that boar, and it was about, the lecture was about blah, blah, blah. He could remember more about it than I could. So that's one of the points. So in terms of the disclosures, this is a CME program after all. No pharmaceutical industry support for the study of this study. There is no study or this presentation. So hopefully you're noticing that's an error, right? Because it's not a study. I'm not going to point out all the errors. I'll just point out that there are errors. Speakers Bureau, I've been on. Not going to talk about medications. And importantly, no small animals were harmed in the making of this presentation. This is another slide that kind of gets people's attention if you want to really grab them. This was from one of my 2 catfish grabbling experiences over near Knoxville, where you fish with your arm, and these catfish eat your arm and use your arm to pull them out of the water from about 6 or 8 feet down and then wrestle them to the surface. So what's our goal? Well, you're going to have many goals if you're giving content. This is obviously a process lecture with some content. But you want to successfully communicate some message or messages to an audience, and hopefully there are not too many messages, because most of us aren't smart enough to figure out more than 1 or 2 or 3 messages in a program. So how do you get there? Passion and knowledge. Passion sets knowledge on fire. If you're not passionate and interested about what you're presenting, do you think the audience is dumb enough that they can't figure that out? If you're not interested in your own material, why would your audience be? Right? So if you're going to pick a grand rounds, and I'm again speaking to the residents selected this topic. I did not. So for the residents, pick a topic that you're passionate about. You have 100% leeway in what you choose, so pick something that you have passion for, and your talk will be better by definition. So audience remembers what? Some words, they remember some body language, tone of your voice. It's surprising what people remember. People think, well, what I cram on the slide is what people are going to remember. Well, that's not true at all. That's been demonstrated time and again in adult learning. That's just not the case. How much do people remember at 48 hours? Well, when you get to be some of our ages, nothing. The answer is 0. But let's assume you do have reasonable cognitive intact hypothalamus. Using knowledge, teaching others, practice skills, discussion, boring lectures. And I've been to so many boring lectures in my life, it's just pathetic. I mean, you want to just walk out because it's just going to be a waste of your time and you're not going to remember much. So try, again, aim for something that has some passion associated with it. What do I want my audience to do, know, and feel at the end of the presentation? That's the question you should be asking yourself. You're presenting on depression, you're presenting on bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder. Whatever the topic is, these are the kinds of questions that are useful to ask. So how do you want to be perceived? Many of us are actually rated on our teaching abilities. So not necessarily at the resident level as much, but for the faculty members, we're rated on how well we present a topic. And in fact, you have a form that I strongly encourage you to fill out today because it's very helpful to the Grand Rounds program, first and foremost. And also to give me feedback on how I've been able to do today on this. But I encourage you to do it. So we're being evaluated all the time. So how you're perceived should be an important consideration in your presentation. So particularly on medical topics where we're talking about people's lives, either in terms of morbidity or mortality, and trying in many instances to convey treatment-oriented messages, I think it's helpful to have some credibility. Credibility is important. So when I work with the residents, I start off and say, do you have a CV? Well, yeah, kind of. I got some ideas. You need to have a CV. Let's buff it up. Let's tune it up. Let's get it as credible as possible so that when you're introduced to give a program or you apply for a job, that you're building on your credibility. It's very important. Knowledge of cutting-edge content. When you present your topic, you probably have looked into it more than anybody else in the room and probably are the most current on that topic compared to anyone else in the room. And that's really important for you to feel that way so that you have the confidence and the credibility. And again, I'm making this point over and over again because boring talks are not remembered and they don't make any impact. You want to be responsive to the audience needs. So you guys wanted me to do a program on this topic, so obviously I'm responsive to the topic request, and then I'm trying to tailor the program to the needs of the audience as best as I can understand it. And hopefully there aren't large empathy gaps in between there because you don't necessarily know your audience as well somewhere else as you would know them here. I think that in general, and there's some research to support this, that if presenters present themselves in a likable, personable way, that also helps people feel more comfortable and some more of the content may be remembered. Obviously, being prepared is very important. I just gave a lecture, a CME lecture for the national meeting of psychiatric pharmacists in Tampa for over 600 people. I spent an hour and 45 minutes with the AV person. We had an audience response system built into the slides. That's, where you have the clickers and you vote on things. Hour and 45 minutes. Went through the whole program. Everything worked flawlessly. I get up there. I'm the lead-off speaker for a 3-day event. I get all mic'd up with my Madonna headset and the whole 9 yards. I didn't have to wear the outfit, just the headset. It's good. Show my first slide, move on to the next slide. Program crashes. 600 people staring at me with a blank screen. Looked a lot like that right there. So what did I do? No, I did not pee in my pants, although that is one option. So what did I do? The show must go on, sure. But hopefully it's the same show. Hopefully not a different show, right? So the next slide was this slide right here. So I always have a printed out copy no matter what. In fact, I carry backup computers, backup thumb drives, backup 3-prong plugs, because I've been there, done that. You name it, it has happened. Last night I go with my Mac, piece of junk, Mac, sorry Mary, plug it into this $4,000 projector, and all of my red is now blue, all of my yellow is now green, and it's completely useless presentation because it has pictures of human beings in it who look like Martians. Played with it for 40 minutes before the program. Could not get it to work. Impossible. So pull out backup LED projector, LCD projector, and use my own. But this kind of stuff happens all the time. And fortunately, we have great people here and decent equipment here, but stuff still happens. So at the very least, just print out your talk so you have it. It sounds so basic and simple, but almost nobody ever does it. So increase your probability, right? Preparation, 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 right? Practice your program. I was told for the pharmacology program that I had exactly this amount of time. I couldn't go over 2 seconds, and they've got this huge clock, right in front of you. Like you're standing at this podium, and there's this clock, and I'm telling you the numbers are this big, right? How many minutes and seconds I have left. And please leave 10 minutes at the end for questions, right? So it's very few people can do that without practicing their program, actually timing it, practicing it to get the program correct. And how many times do we see grand rounds where the grand rounds is finished in 20 minutes and there's 40 minutes left for questions? Probably too short a talk. And then we also see a lot where they go over and there's no time, and that's one way to eliminate the question and answer period, which I'll get to in later slides. So we're on to that. Pitch, poise, modeling, paying attention to feedback. Some of these I think are obvious, but they all increase the probability that you will be effective and not boring in delivering the important content that you're there to deliver and that you've spent a lot of time working on. So some of the deadly sins of public speaking, right? Not meeting the audience's needs, right? Unclear purpose. What is the talk about? Sometimes I get halfway through somebody's lecture and what is this about again? I mean, it's unclear. It may not even represent what is in the title of the program. And sometimes these are in CME-oriented programs. I mean, not just rookie speakers. Too much unnecessary information, slides with hundreds of words on them. I've seen slides that literally had 400 words on a single slide in a font about that big in a presentation. And I'm looking at that, it's like, really? And then you just kind of tune out because you're not meeting the audience's needs because the audience is not wearing binoculars. They can't read it. Unclear and appropriate AV, reading the talk, you see that all the time. I mean, you'll see these errors all the time. So English as a second language, very important issue, particularly in psychiatry, where somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% of psychiatrists have English as a second or third language. Doesn't have to be a big impediment. These are some of the countries where we've had people present from. Yeah. And as a reviewer for about a dozen journals, this happens with authors as well. So somebody doesn't speak English as a first language, they write the paper, they send it into an English language journal, and they never ran it past somebody who speaks English as a first language. So what do you think is going to happen to that paper? It's going to get bounced and probably will never even be read or reviewed. It's just bounced because it's not readable. And the same thing can happen in presentations. Very easy to speak too fast, very uncommon for people to speak too slow. Very uncommon. It's almost always the other way around. And it's good when the audience wants to interrupt you. It shows that you're confident, that you're not locked into your talk, and that you're answering the needs of the audience in real time when they need the answer. So when I hear people say, well, can you hold your question to the end? Well, yeah, I can, but I'm probably not going to remember it because you just showed me a slide showing how much I'm not going to remember. So unless I write it down, what's the point? So I tend to disagree with waiting to the end. There are some situations where it might be useful, but generally meet the needs of the audience when you can. So performance anxiety, and I was actually serious about the beginning there with the 3x5 cards. So in 1983, I gave my first Grand Rounds presentation at in my program at Dayton, Wright State, and it was terrifying, literally terrifying. I had every single word written out on a stack of 3x5 cards, honest to God. Petrified. Cicero, Roman order. I turn pale at the outset of a speech and quake in my every limb and soul. Right? Performance anxiety. I get nervous before every talk I give. That's after 500 to 700 programs. I suspect it'll still be true after 1,000 or after 2,000. And the point is, if you don't have some anxiety, you're probably not going to give a good program, and I'll show you that on the next slide. I think humor is important in breaking the ice and getting people a little more comfortable so that they can hear things easier. And of course, as we talked about earlier, exposure therapy really does work for this. The more of these you do, the better you will get. It's really that simple. As long as you're getting feedback and using the feedback, and there's nothing better than a video of yourself doing a program so you can say, oh my God, that really sucked. I can't believe I did that. I can't believe, that I was standing there and my microphone fell off the second time. Yeah, I can't believe that. And I can't believe I never looked at the audience, or I can't believe I kept my back to Dr. White the entire time so that he could see nothing but the back of my vest. And you'll see all of these things that you can address once you see them. And I went through a lot of public speaking training that involved video feedback with professional trainers, who then in turn would say, look at these behaviors, this might be more effective, that might be more effective if you did this or did that. And of course, some people have social phobia in addition to a specific type of anxiety in a social setting like this. And most anxiety doesn't show. So even though I may be very anxious in front of 600 people, which frankly I was, because that's one of the bigger audiences I've presented to, people in my general environment would not be able to detect that because, you know, I'm not visibly anxious. I'm internally anxious. I'm having that experience in my head, not in any way that's visible physically, but it's still there. So this is my simplistic graph about performance on one axis and amount of anxiety on the other axis. So if you're down here and you have no anxiety at all, you could be dead. So check your pulse. All right, you have a pulse, then you're probably doing a pretty lousy talk. So not dead, no anxiety, lousy talk. Pretty good chance. It would be better to be dead in that situation. Then you have the zone. So you have an optimal area here where your anxiety is enhancing your cognitive functioning, because as we all know, one of the reasons for PTSD is because your cognitive functioning and your ability to imprint memories is greatly enhanced by anxiety. And usually, if you're in the middle of a combat situation, your anxiety is high, your epinephrine is high. And so there are performance reasons why this happens. So you have to have a certain amount of anxiety to function optimally physically, as well as function optimally cognitively. It works in both spheres. However, if you go over the top, the ultimate thing that happens would be a panic attack, where your performance goes to 0. So if you're having a panic attack, you can't really present. And likewise, if you're in this area here, you're not in a panic attack, but you're just so anxious that you can't even get through your material, and then you revert to literally reading it off the slides or reading it off of your cards. So I would say that I started off somewhere around in here, not overt panic attack, but somewhere around in this zone here, and over time have worked my way up to generally being in here, although sometimes I find myself on a low energy situation or late at night, and I might end up somewhere over here. And then try to get back into the zone is what you want to do in terms of efficacy. So the venue, obviously we're talking about, yes sir. Yeah, please, go back. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Right, exactly. So here's a mistake that I'm making. Did you all hear what his question was or his point was? Even back there in the cheap seats? Okay, I'm surprised. You want to repeat what he says and synopsize it in general, because most people can't hear the rest. So I could just respond to him and say, yeah, I agree, blah, 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 and people are like, what was that about? So you could hear him, that's good, but normally you'd want to say, yeah, some people do use propranolol, usually to poor effect, because what it does is it moves people, sorry, there's another mistake. It moves people from here over to here. So they tend to have, flat affect. Their energy level is down. They're not anxious necessarily, but they come across as kind of lackadaisical, and they may not even be aware of it. You need to see yourself on a video. Likewise for things like taking the boards. People used to do that all the time as well. Generally doesn't work, but people like to try it. So getting there early, assuming that your AV support is poor, and I've demonstrated 2 out of the last 2 times where I had AV disasters. I think it's a pretty big AV disaster when you lose your program after 1 slide in front of 600 people. Oh, I walked into one place once that just bring your thumb drive, we've got it all covered. So I bring my thumb drive, and I had my thumb drive and come in, and people are all there, and the projector's right here, and you know what it is? One of those overhead projectors with the plastic rolling sheet on it. Honest to God, true story. So I set my thumb drive on there and turned the light on. I said, well, there's my whole talk. Any questions? That's what they had. Of course, then I went to my car, pulled on my own computer, an LCD projector, and cord, and set it all up. But, unfortunately, you have to do that. Being flexible with obstacles, giving presentations in areas where there are beams in the room, like in our conference center at the VA, there are beams, and people will sit behind the beams, and it's just crazy how bad a lot of venues are. And you want to own the room. You want to own the whole room. I don't want to stand with my back to Dr. White half the time like I've been demonstrating what not to do. Right? I want to be able to present and project to everybody in the room, not just the people on the side that's comfortable for me to look at. So, and this is a big problem. You know, you get people, you know, you only want to use this when it's needed. You know, it's going to magnify any tremors that you have. You know, don't use it for the first few slides. It's just your name and the title of the program. Why do you need to use a slide pointer for that, right? Holding hand away from screen, tuck elbow into your side, rest hand. I mean, avoid putting out the eyes of your audience. You know what I mean? You know, you leaving it on, oh, I forgot to take my thumb off of it, right? Unless you're playing with your cat down on the, that works real good for that. But I tend to not use these a lot, but you'll see speakers come in and do this all the time. I don't know about you, I get a seizure when I see this. So podium behavior. If you're 5'4" and 5'6" wearing cowboy boots, are podiums your friend? No, not at all. I felt bad for the Japanese prime minister. He's standing up there. He had his podium, and Obama had his podium. And by protocol, the podiums can't be different sizes because it suggests that one person's more powerful than the other. So the Japanese guy's over there, it's about up to his chin. And Obama's over there, his arms or his knuckles are on top of the podium. You know. But podiums are an obstacle. I never use them if I can avoid it. I really like to have microphones so that I can walk around, because otherwise, this is what we're looking at. Okay, I got my slides in front of me and I'm at the podium. Okay, so white knuckler, right? That's where people are hanging on there and their knuckles are white and they're hanging onto that podium. By God, it is stabilizing their anxiety, isn't it? Then there's the ship's captain. Ahoy, matey! Now we're going to talk about the next slide, and we're going to be rocking back and forth because we're anxious, and we don't really know what to do with that. Then there's the foxholer. I'm so anxious that it's best to just hang out low. Can't see me. No anxiety here. So if you can avoid a podium, it generally is better. The more formal the presentation, the more likely you are to be stuck with a podium, and I hate that. But that's what happens, all right? So visual impact problems, right? So how many times do you have people giving a lecture, you know, and they're up here talking about their thing, and you're looking down at what I'm doing, and as opposed to listening to what I'm saying because I'm playing with the keys and my change in my pocket, and I have no awareness that I'm doing that. People do that all the time. So take all this crap out of your pockets so you're not tempted to do that. So you got a lot of people who don't know what to do with their hands. So they'll protect their genitals. You know, with a guy like this sitting this close to me, I got to worry about that. So I'll do this sometimes, or I'll do that, you know, maybe a cocktail arm. I can put a pointer there, or I can do something with that, right? 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 SeaWorld, you know, that's where people are like flapping their arms all around because they don't know what to do with their arms. So like I was saying about content, remember? They move their arms around. Leaning tower. So I'm stabilizing my anxiety, and I'm stabilizing my hands because I don't know what to do with them. So as long as I do this, I'm all good, right? These are all binding anxiety, don't know what to do with your hands. Then one of my personal favorites, because I used to do this, the tarantula push-ups. So, as I was saying, look at these tarantulas, right? And I didn't realize I was doing that until I saw a video presentation of me giving a talk, and I was over here doing this. Just unconsciously, what do you do with your hands, right? So a pointer can actually be helpful, even if you're not using it, because it gives you something to do with your hands that's legitimate. So audience factors to consider. So knowing the audience is really helpful. It helps bind your anxiety, and it helps you to target what's going on, and it helps you to know where some potential pitfalls are. Now last night, I didn't know a single person in the room, not one. Very common. and I'm giving a presentation on serious mental illness. Well, it comes out to be that 4 of the people in the audience are peer support specialists. Does anybody know what that field is? It's a very emerging field in the treatment of chronic mental illness, where people with a chronic mental illness that are functioning reasonably at a high level are hired by organizations. The VA is a big supporter of peer support counselors. So they have bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and they're part of the team. So they're in the audience. I had no idea. So you can imagine the potential pitfalls if you don't know that and you start throwing words like crazy around, or you go off the reservation and say things that are going to be offensive to people, like going off the reservation. Got that? Okay. So it's helpful to know. You never know who's going to be in the audience. All right? Are there any hitmen in the audience? If you know that there's somebody in the audience who disagrees with your theory or what you're going to present on, it's helpful to know that, because then you can think of the potential questions that person may or may not ask in the question and answer session. So it's useful. And what's the motivation for attendance, right? So if it's mandatory, there are going to be people that aren't really interested, or if it's entirely optional, the energy may be different. I personally like to feel the energy from an audience because it makes me a better speaker. If I feel like people are engaged in the content and listening to what I'm saying, then I in turn ping off the audience, which makes for a better talk, and then they ping off of me, and you get this positive feedback loop that makes for a high energy program that people tend to like and hopefully will remember something of. So the eye contact thing, we talked a little bit about it in terms of facing the whole room and not ignoring one side. It's very common for people who are on this side of an audience with right-handed speakers who are on this side of the screen to never make eye contact with that side of the room. And just watch speakers, you'll see. You guys won't even get looked at, right? So the people back there, like looking over people's heads, that's a common technique people use to avoid eye contact. It makes it look like, so I'm looking at Alex up there, but I could be looking at a foot over his head, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. All right? So when you're making eye contact, you're hopefully doing it around a topic, right? So if I'm making a point, I finish my point before I leave your face and before I move on to your face to go to the next topic. And that's the single thought, one person. So if I want to make a point about how to make a good presentation, I don't want to do it like this and do it like this, and I'm on this one slide, and you know what I'm saying? Really, we should do it that way. What do you think? So this takes some conscious work. This is not something that comes naturally to most people, certainly not me. So visual overstimulation can happen, and again, the laser pointer is the most common one. Disorganized thinking, often due to anxiety, right? Increased nervousness that's physically visible. So you have both internal and externally visible anxiety. So holding an audience's attention is difficult. I mean, we're all busy, we're all tired, a lot of us are sleep deprived. We may not be interested in the topic. You have people literally falling asleep in the audience, not infrequently. People on their Blackberries, or whatever cell phone they happen to have. So you want to make some mixture of content and delivery. The content is the easy part, y'all. I mean, anybody can make slides and put information on it, right? Any of us can do that. But how do you make that content come alive? And that's the other half. It's the delivery. The best content in the world is dead content if it isn't presented in a way that people can hear it. Yeah, this is what I saw when I just sailed across the ocean in January and February. A lot of that. What are you thinking about when you see that? This is the audience participation part. Dr. Hendrick. Cell phone towers, isolation, the default bad screen on the computer. You can see these are completely unrelated things that you're each offering up as thoughts that come to your mind, because if I don't direct your attention, you're going to figure out something to think about yourself. you're going to fill in the blank yourself. So this is a blank canvas, and everybody's going to fill in their own blank. And it's not going to be necessarily, and highly unlikely to be, what I want you to be thinking about. So I've got to control your attention. Right? I can't allow you to go off somewhere else. If I don't give you something interesting to look at, you're going to make something up. That's pretty interesting. You're probably focused on that. Probably not thinking about cell phone towers. So David Sheehan, as some of us have seen give presentations, famous psychopharmacology-oriented psychiatrist, never say in one slide what you can say in half a dozen. And I'm a total believer in that. I'd rather have 60 slides in 60 minutes that each have this amount of content than 30 slides or 20 slides that are just overwhelming in the amount of content they have in them. So keep that in mind, right? Electrons are really cheap. I have 65 fonts on my computer. Can I use them all? And we've seen this in some resident presentations in the past. Yeah, sure. If you'd like to write ransom notes. You know, 1 or 2, maybe 3 on the outside, if you're using it effectively, is what most people would recommend. So how often do you see this? You know, I can't read that. You know, tiny little fonts, can't see it in the back. Way too much info. I hate it when there's typos. I just hate it when there's typos. Don't you? Because you think, you know, if you didn't care enough to get the typos out, why should we care? I mean, these are unconscious processes. I don't think anybody sits there in the audience and says that to themselves. I think that there's still an unconscious concept there. Distracting color combinations. Not everybody can see all these colors, right? You know, 8 to 10% of the population is going to have trouble with some of these things. I've seen some people kind of like go retro with black and white slideshows and gray slideshows. I guess if you want to, you know, be retro and make a statement, but they're just not as effective. And that's not my opinion. There's clear data from adult learning literature that they're just not effective. Simpler is definitely better. You know, you can say a lot with 3 words on a slide. And I'm not going to talk about the Earth, but say the topic was about, you know, global warming or whatever. This would be a fantastic slide to talk about a complex concept like global warming with 3 simple words and a picture. So here's a typical slide that we'll see in a lot of our presentations. Not necessarily a bad slide. I mean, the fonts are big enough to read, I think, for the most part. You know, it does have 5 columns, but it's complicated information. It's difficult to break a slide like this up into multiple slides. But it's what you do with this slide. I mean, if you're going to go through this slide, you know, well, the age was, you know, 37. What you want to do with a complicated slide like this is the slide's complicated, but how you discuss the slide can be more simple. So they say, a lot of data here. I wanted to put it up for you to see it, but really the most important thing on the slide that I want to draw your attention to is that the total PAN scores, as you can see, were not really that high. So these patients weren't nearly as sick as the patients you're going to see coming on to E2 or Woodridge, blah, 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 blah. Right? So I'm drawing your attention in from this complicated slide that I really can't do anything with to make it better, but I can do it verbally. So, you know, if people are in the audience and they're on their Blackberries, right? Got a little Blackberry thing going on here. You want to control the attention. Tell them what they're seeing, tell them what it means, and this adds value, right? Don't just read the slides because anybody can do that. So, complicated slide, you know, blah, blah, blah. Again, you talk about it and add value to the slide. It's not just telling people what is on the slide. It's what do you think it means? How does this apply to the concept of depression? You know, why is this important? What part of the brain are these receptors in? I'm just using it as an example. So the toughest part of a talk, especially the more formalized talks where you have microphones set up in an aisle in a ballroom, like I had a week ago Sunday, that is the toughest part of the talk. Unscripted entirely, no backup plan. You know, you have no idea what somebody's going to come up with. No idea, right? So you can give your lecture, but now they're going to find out whether you really are full of crap or not, because they're going to ask you questions, hopefully, that are intelligent and go to next level below what you showed on the slide, right? So my fear, and anybody's fear should be, if you're thinking about this, is now they're going to really see that I don't know what I'm talking about. It's my first grand rounds as a resident, and I got all my content down, but by God, that Dr. Brown's going to ask me a question, and I'm not going to know how to answer it. I'm going to look like a fool. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point, and I'm not going to repeat it because you're in the back of the room where people can hear you as opposed to somebody sitting in the front. But that's an excellent point. You could say, we started at 5 after, my instructions from the organization was that I should speak for no more than 45 minutes to leave 10 minutes at the end for questions, but feel free to bring questions up during the talk as we go along. That would be a good way to address that. Absolutely. Thanks. Like the second bullet. And there are, in fact, stupid questions. I mean, let's just call it what it is. There are definitely stupid questions. You'll hear them all the time. From people who are asleep, working on their Blackberry, whatever, they snap awake and decide, oh, I'm going to ask this. Completely disconnected from the program, came out of some psychotic fantasy they were engaged in while they were asleep. And then they get up in front of a microphone and ask you the question. So yes, indeed, there are plenty of stupid questions. Doesn't mean that you can't answer them, don't have to answer them. But, in fact, recognize that there are stupid questions. So why is this the most important, potentially most important part? Because, people are curious, and you only have a limited amount of time. If I'm presenting you, 2 years of transgender research, which is what I would choose if I was picking a topic, how can I really effectively do that in 45 minutes? I can give you some basic idea about what I did and what the results, some of the results were, but methods, I can't really go in depth in methods, and people who are thinking the next level down are going to have questions about that will bring out, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, sex and gender are conflated in the VA database, and they're exactly the same, and that wasn't on a slide, for example. So you do have some higher learning potential, and you get to reemphasize important points that people bring out, and I also rely on it because really important points I might forget. And somebody else will say, hey, well, what about this situation? I said, fantastic. I forgot to mention that, but your question is spot on, and then you get to give the answer, and you should have included it in the talk in the first point. Okay, then there's a recency effect. That means last things said or heard tend to be remembered the best. So a recency phenomenon. So the types of questioners, I've seen them all. You got your nitpicker. Well, Dr. Brown, I saw that was 43% and the other one was 42%. How do you account for that difference? The truly clueless everywhere, person who jerks awake in the middle of the program, doesn't even know what lecture they're in. Somebody stumbles in from primary care residency thinking this is their grand rounds and they're in the wrong place, and they'll ask a question about hypertensive drugs during the antidepressant lecture. I've seen it all. Hostile attackers, somebody who has it out for you or who has it out for your field. I present on a lot of controversial topics. I've actually, the biggest audience I've ever spoken to was an audience of about 1,000 people in a massive Hilton ballroom in an Air Force uniform, and to be shouted down by ACT UP in the early days of HIV and told that I was a Nazi psychiatrist. I'd say that's fairly hostile. I don't think many people have had that experience unless you're maybe the mayor of Baltimore right now. But in a professional presentation, to be called a Nazi psychiatrist, uncommon, tends to put you off your stable footing for a moment. And you have to really regroup around something like that. Unfortunately, I've not had that experience since, but I certainly have had a lot of hostile people in audiences, presenting in front of 800 parents, where the principal of the school was transitioning from male to female during the summer. And I was hired to do a presentation on what that means and to address all the parents' concerns in an evening presentation. Imagine that. Oh, in a lower class, upstate New York environment. A lot of hostile people in the audience. What's wrong with killing the messenger? Nobody's ever told me. Why? Kill the messenger. That's what these people wanted to do. So how you handle that is you're not going to find out in a book somewhere. It takes experience, right? And we're not going to run into these things here that are sometimes out of the range of civility, actually. But it does happen. The pedantic sublecturer, you'll see this all the time. So somebody comes in and they're listening to your talk, and then they get up. Well, in my research, Dr. Brown, I found that the transgender patients that we studied in a sample of N equals 3 in Croatia, that there really was no significant suicidality compared to our control group of 3 Bosnians. And I just wanted to tell you about that research because it's really important, and thank you very much. All the time that happens. The higher in the audience, the more likely you're going to have a pedantic sublecturer who's going to use the time to self-aggrandize or to present research that they think is important using that environment. Well, yes, the visual stuff is important, but really, I just think we should have more content, whatever. So there's the yes, butter, and trying to deal with the questions around that. The axe grinder, and there are people, if you get prominent enough in any field, there are going to be people who want to hurt you professionally. You will see it. And they have an axe to grind with you. It may have nothing to do with your lecture, may have never even met you, but they happen to be in the audience, and they'll use that opportunity to try to mess you up, frankly. And then, of course, there's the wise guys. So there's a lot of different types of questioners that can increase your anxiety around a question and answer period. And the more the people in the room, the more likely you are to have many of these types of questioners. And the higher end, the high-end CMEs, the big audiences, much more likely to have folks like this. I can remember once I watched Otto Kernberg give a lecture in front of probably 1,500 people, and with all the microphones set up down both of the aisles, and it was a brilliant lecture. And the first question, he was talking about borderline, psychotherapy borderline patients, as you might imagine. And so the first question that somebody asked, they get up the microphone, the room's quiet, 1,500 people. So, Dr. Kernberg, how much do you charge your patients? Honest to God, first question out of the box. And I remember what he said, this is 20 years ago. I charge them enough so that I don't resent them. Brilliant response to an inappropriate question. The question was grossly inappropriate in the context of this lecture, but I remember it 20 years later. All right, so if you're clueless, which, probably is the case in a lot of situations, right? If you ask me 5 quotations, 5 references to support that color works better than black and white, I'm going to tell you I can't give you those references off the top of my head. But I'd say, but I can get back to you on that. Give me your email address, and I'll get back to you on that. So that's one approach, because you can't remember everything. And so getting back to your question in the back, well, what if you have 15 minutes left, and everybody's asleep because you were a really boring speaker, and nobody asked you any questions, right? So, well, if it's an evening program and everybody's tired, I say, well, thank you very much for your attention. Have a good night, because I just want to get out of there. Or if it's a program like this, I can say, well, I often get asked this question when I give a lecture like this. And I'm wondering if anybody else is wondering about this particular issue, because this is how I would handle it. So you ask yourself your own questions that a more awake audience might ask. Or maybe it just didn't come to their mind. So I try to think of questions that I would have if I were listening to this program. What would I want to know that isn't up there? And I'll ask myself that question. Keeping the questions on track, and get people who will monopolize. And if there are a lot of questions, try to work the whole room so that one side's not getting preferential treatment over the other. Is also a good technique, again, to keep audiences on your side. So you want to summarize. You want to have a strong finish. You want to say, this is what I told you I was going to tell you. This is what we talked about, and we had some good audience participation around these particular issues. And let me just summarize the important points about what we talked about today. We talked about the use of color. We talked about how to use your hands, how to not use a podium, whatever I think the most important points are. Then I'm going to remind them with the recency effect being helpful. And, oh, yeah, that last thing he said about not being a white knuckler at the podium, I'm going to remember that when I give my grand rounds next month. I'm going to remember not to stand behind the podium and do that. So you don't want to leave the audience confused, feeling like they weren't heard, unable to ask questions, because it's frustrating. A lot of people, the way to get rid of the dreaded Q&A is just to burn up all the time. Run the clock out by all means, right? So you look at your watch. God, there's 3 minutes left. I got to burn that 3 minutes up. All right. So the common errors, too much info, too little time, AV issues, failing to match the talk to the audience. These are all the things that we talked about. Not repeating the audience questions. So there is time left for questions, and I'm very interested in any that you might have. Sure. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Bangles, yeah. Yeah, and body piercings that bang together, things like that too. Yeah, good point. Mm-hmm. Right, so I would summarize your excellent feedback as preparation is really key, and preparation is not just having the printout of your talk. You really need to have incorporated the key concepts that are in the printout so that you don't look like you're reading off the sheet also. So it's preparation at multiple levels will save you. And I know that other speakers like Dr. Hendrick, who have done hundreds as well, has been through all of these things himself. And what saves the day is knowing your material and being prepared. John.
I was over in Winston-Salem and I got stuck in this L-shaped room. So there are two wings, basically, of this restaurant. So I go, of course, to set up at the top of the L so that I can view down both wings, at which point the maitre d' of the restaurant comes up to me and says, "Oh, you can't stand there. That's where the servers put all the food line through." So I ended up on the other side of the L, like flipping back and forth at 90-degree angles throughout the talk. How can you control a room that is so poorly designed?
Yeah. I thought we were going to end up with a pedantic sub-lecture right there, but he pulled it out right at the end.
Let me tell you about my last talk.
Yeah. I mean, Some rooms are they're just so difficult, you know, with poles in the way and the way they're set up, and they were never designed to have a program in them. And one of the ways that you do the best you can, but one of the ways that I deal with it is I do a lot more walking around, and I buy one of the remote slide changers for $60 from Targus. Targus is the company that I have mine from, and I do not get any commercial support from Targus. But you can walk around with it. So if you have this weird shaped room, I can walk down into this part of the room. I can still change my slide, which I'm not dependent on anyway. And then I can walk over to the other side of the room, change my slide, and work it that way. That's probably the best thing that I can think of to deal with it. The Troutdale, which is now closed, because they didn't give us enough commercial support, was famous for being one of the worst venues to give a program at. Terrible. For that reason, shaped like an L. Dr. Goodkin, got a microphone behind you there.
Would you want to say anything about setting up your talk to meet CME expectations and the
Oh,
burden
yeah.
of doing
Okay,
it?
thank you for prompting me. We actually had discussed this a little bit before. There are requirements for CME programs that all speakers have to attend to, but the level of rigidity of the CME offices that make these requests varies greatly from one organization to another, even though ostensibly they're dealing with exactly the same set of requirements. So whereas like this Tampa program a week and a half ago, I can't tell you how much time writing up the questions and then having them all rejected by the organization, saying, well, you can't have any questions that have A and not B. You can't have any questions that have none of the above or all of the above. Well, that isn't in any CME requirements, that you can't have those style questions. It's not anywhere. But they personalized the CME requirements and made them 5 times more rigid, and actually wanted to change content in my lecture on cross-sex hormones, which I thought was very interesting since none of them know how to do it. So, I mean, at a certain point, you just say, you know, obviously I don't know this material well enough to write one question that you'll accept, and there's problems with the content. Let me know how it turns out. I mean, there's just a certain amount of cooperation that you could do. But fortunately, our requirements here are very reasonable. You know, you have to meet the requirements to get the credit. And if you follow the rules the way they're written, it's not all that onerous. Thank you for remembering that.
One thing I'd like to fold into the requirements discussion is the fact that there's got to be an appropriate amount, adequate amount of feedback for each of the CME lectures. And so I would encourage everyone here today to fill out one of these surveys if they haven't already.
Recency effect. Remember that. One more. Yeah.
You mentioned the pointer that you bought. And one thing I've noticed a lot here and on the main campus, that a pointer and a changer, slide changer, is for people who have that maybe about this tall and have tiny little hands. Because my thumb is so big.
Mm-hmm.
And I see all the people doing it.
Yeah, they're really close together. Mine, I just used it for the first time yesterday. I was real happy with it. There's enough room, there's enough space that my thumb doesn't hit the, because what it has is it has a forward button on the right, a backward button on the left, and then right in the middle is a big laser spot. And you can't mix them up in your hand. It's worked pretty well. I actually have it here if you want to look at it afterwards. Those are terrible. Yeah, they're terrible. Yeah. Any last question before we break up? Tom.
Those pointers work more easily for you because you have hypertrophy skills with respect to your thumb.
Possibly so. It's a wise guy. That's the wise guy. You can count on that. Appreciate your attention.